Fantastic. We've got a good crowd. Right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to kick off now. So welcome, first of all, to our session on cloud, COGS, margin, and the new rapidly evolving SaaS P&L. I'm Ed Barrow, founder and CEO of Cloud Capital. I'm super excited to be joined by Ben Murray, the SaaS CFO, although, as I was told recently, Ben is actually the Christian Ronaldo of CFOs. So welcome to an illustrious guest with us today. Thanks, Ben, for joining us.
Yeah, great to be here. Excited about this. I think this is a topic near and dear to every CFO and controller. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to dive in a second to the session we've got, but we're really hoping for it to be an interactive session today. So if you've just joined us, make sure you find the chat. It's on the bottom right for you. We'll be having a chat. We'll be having some Q&A where you can drop your questions. We'll be running some polls. So aiming to have this as a kind of really interactive working session on cloud and its growing impact on all of our financial models. In terms of the agenda, so we're going to really talk through how cloud is becoming an intrinsic part of the financial system that we're all building as technology businesses, how AI is rapidly reshaping those costs and driving very different behaviors in terms of how those costs scale and operate, and how you can build predictability, visibility, and control into your cloud and AI inference cost management, and how you can shape the ownership between finance and engineering. So we're going to kind of try and cover pretty broad array of topics today and really dig into some valuable quantified data as well, so you can really understand what's going on in the market, benchmark your own business against what is happening with others. What's really backing this is we did some really interesting analysis at the tail end of last year, surveying over 100 growth stage CFOs and finance leaders across the UK and the US on really digging into how cloud infrastructure is impacting their P&L. I think there's a lot of data out there. I think there's a lot of people talking about investments in data centers and in AI, but actually much closer to home as finance leaders, we're seeing a lot of impact directly onto the P&L. That cloud spend, which was maybe a forgotten part of the cost base, has risen very dramatically. And then we get a lot of questions from people trying to understand kind of how to benchmark what they're seeing in their business versus the market, and understand, what's their performance like relative to others. So we ran this survey. It's available live on the Cloud Capital website. One of my teammates is going to drop the link into the chat as well. So if you're interested in getting the kind of complete set of insights, we're going to run through some highlights today. But if you want to dig into more detail on that, you can go to cloudcapital.co and access the full report. I think what's most important now is to see that cloud has really transformed within the many of startups and software businesses. Cloud is now the largest variable cost line for most technology companies. Is typically the second largest cost line after headcount. In fact, I was talking to an AI native startup just this morning who very excitedly and proudly announced that actually for them, their cloud and infrastructure costs have now eclipsed their payroll costs. It's the number one line item on their P&L. And that's certainly what we're seeing, that cloud has risen to be that second largest line item for most people, highly variable, highly opaque in terms of what you're actually spending and how that's likely to change over time. And if it was a sort of rapidly approaching dark cloud for many of us, AI has turned that into something that is much, much larger and much, much more urgent, and really starting to have a material impact on the fundamental unit economics of software businesses. I think a lot of us have built software businesses over the last few years on a fairly established playbook where you should be expecting 80% gross margin, and if you've got that, then there's a whole kind of predictable playbook you can run on sales and marketing investments and R&D investments. We're seeing cloud and AI costs rise so rapidly and so significantly that actually that fundamental assumption of a SaaS business has a recurring high gross margin revenue stream is being undermined. And that's leading to big reevaluation of actually how do you run a software business, what can you afford to spend on sales and marketing and R&D when you've got such a radically different kind of business profile. So the first question, sorry, go for it, Ben.
Oh, and that's a big point right there. And I actually have a blog post on that of the SaaS math versus AI math. And as you're transitioning, if you're legacy SaaS transitioning to AI, or even just building an AI native platform, you said right. Yeah, if your margin profile is much different, you've got to almost operate your business a little bit differently, how you think about OpEx and different unit costs. So yeah, it's a really important point.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think about gross margin for kind of both AI native businesses who are starting out this way, but also the more traditional SaaS businesses who are rapidly adding AI capabilities to their products and services. When you're starting to talk about a gross margin dipping from 80 down to 30, 40, 50%, that obviously has a direct impact from a cost perspective. But then when you start to think about investment decisions, your LTV to CAC and your payback period, all of those should really be assessed on a gross profit basis. And if you're making materially less gross profit, you really need to think much more carefully about how you invest in new customer acquisition and customer management. And so it's a much, much bigger impact than just saying, oh, the bill is that much larger. It's a very different business model to operate. I think it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of AI native businesses who are sort of looking at, their plans and saying, actually, we don't think we need to scale headcount anywhere near as quickly because an AI native business. But maybe that's the other way around. Maybe actually you can't afford to scale headcount as quickly as an AI native business because you're spending so much on cloud and infrastructure.
Yeah, and Eric dropped a link to that post, to my blog post, and I think any AI founder, CFO really has to understand it's almost a little different business operating model, and the unit economics are so important. The margin for error is so much thinner, unless you've got just tons of capital, tons of funding that you can burn through cash. But you're right. So, but the post is there, but we could talk an hour about that, but yeah.
And I think it has big implications, for those businesses, sort of that, like, maybe to use words like kind of traditional SaaS business that maybe doesn't have access to that level of capital, but now is needing to make those kind of AI investments and transform their product, but also see a rapid transformation of the business model. So I think, we're really seeing a big risk to the business model. So the first question we always get asked is, I'm spending for any kind of CFO, I'm spending X on cloud, on AI infrastructure, cloud infrastructure. Is that good? Am I massively overinvested or massively underinvested in infrastructure relative to my scale? So the first thing we actually did, and as I mentioned, we ran this state of compute survey with 100 growth stage CFOs, and the first question we said is, how much are you spending on cloud as a percentage of revenue? And typically, most organizations are spending somewhere between 10 to 20% of revenue on cloud. Now, as we look at the data and kind of dig into this, kind of what you might expect, which is earlier stage businesses are generally spending a greater percentage of revenue on cloud, and you start to get efficiencies as you scale. And you start to see, particularly when you have maybe more cost conscious and efficiency conscious investors like PE-backed businesses, you see a greater or a lower cost as a percentage of revenue. But this is still very material, right? We see quite a decent number of companies where they're in the sort of 16 to 20 or even 20% plus range. So this is not a small line item that is going to stay in the background. It's actually pretty front and center. We have just launched a poll as well. So if you're interested in sharing and understanding where you're at, you can go into the chat and into poll, and you feel free to put your answer in for this, and we'll see how that distribution looks within the group we've got here today.
Yeah, I'd love to hear everyone's thought. Where do you stand as a percentage of revenue spent on cloud, which would be interesting if you can answer that poll. And when I saw this chart, and guys, I think screenshot this chart, but I looked at PE-backed, right? We know a lot of PE-backed companies, SaaS companies out there. And looks like the biggest kind of bubble on that column was the blue, so 5 to 8%. Which to me that kind of rings true, because if you think we're going for 80% best in class SaaS gross profit, again, depending, are we AI first, all that stuff. But yeah, that's about right, because in COGS, we've got tech support, we may have professional services, we may have a customer success team, and they're all taking a piece of that, say 20 to 30% pie in COGS. So yeah, Ed is like, yeah, that sounds about right, 5 to 8% on that PE backside.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. I think the one interesting note that we'll make now and we'll come back to later is, of course, not all of your cloud infrastructure, your AI infrastructure spend is actually a cost of goods sold. So one of the nuances and important things to be able to do is be actually able to break out what are you spending that actually relates to serving your product to your customers, your production spend. That should be part of your cost of goods sold. But actually, a lot of organizations typically have 30 to 40% of their actual cloud costs don't relate to production, don't relate to serving the customers. They relate to testing, development, model training, as we'll talk about later. Those costs should be part of your OpEx. And so a lot of organizations often kind of stick their whole Google Cloud bill, a whole AWS bill straight into COGS. And maybe that's having a detrimental impact on where they kind of see their gross margin.
Yeah, and that's what I did every month. Part of close is split it up. What goes to sales as far as demo environments, or and what goes to dev for test environments. And I don't know if I have a rule of thumb here, but I'd say if I've help a lot of SaaS founders with their financials metrics, but if my bucket is DevOps, which includes hosting, infrastructure, and again, what kind of AI influence do we have on this? Any third-party software embedded in our product to make it work, security, compliance. But if that rises above 10% of revenue, then it's like, okay, we kind of, what's going on here? And also, what stage are we at? Are we continuing to scale, invest heavily? Or are we now trying to optimize for gross profit? That kind of is important for that perspective. But yeah, it's like, if it's above 10, it's like, okay, kind of, what's going on here?
Yeah. And I think the other reality that's emerging is that level of scrutiny on gross margin is coming earlier in the company life cycle. So I think, historically, you could kind of build a business, start scaling it, and really, investors would be more interested, your board would be more interested in gross margin at kind of Series C, Series D. Are we really, looking to optimize that? No, if you sell the business to a private equity fund. We're increasingly seeing much earlier stage investors on funding rounds place far greater scrutiny on gross margin, and having a good understanding of where a company's gross margin is today and how that's going to evolve and expand. You start seeing those questions at Series B. We've been helping at least one startup at doing a Series A who needs to be able to answer those questions for the fundraise.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear, everyone's thoughts in the chat, as far as like gross margins and AI first and all that stuff. And Ed, I interview founders for my podcast, and if they are AI native or AI first, I have to ask, what's your gross profit expectation, right? We see a lot of noise, a lot of social media posts about, well, AI is going to be lower margins, and it may be, but a lot of them that I ask, they are still shooting eventually to scale to 70, 80% gross profit. Now, it's going to vary. And even, when I was helping traditional SaaS before AI, and if it was a heavy compute product or a database type product, and we knew maybe we'd only get to 60% because it was just such heavy compute depending on the product we're offering, a CRM versus, say, a database type product, so that colors everything. But I see, at least in my limited data set, that AI first founders still want to shoot for those pure play SaaS gross margins.
Yeah. The question, of course, is how do we get there? And what's the plan? What's the strategy to be able to get to those kind of ultimate margins?
Mm-hmm.
So if this is where people kind of sat today, I think the next question we always get asked is, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that, again, when we did the survey, 80% of CFOs have actually said their cloud spend is increasing as a percentage of revenue, which is the opposite of what you want, right? You're going to be thinking as your business is growing, and most of these companies are growing businesses, you would be hoping and expecting your infrastructure spend as a percentage of revenue should be going down over time. There's a hopefully a sublinear scaling of those costs as you scale. But actually, a lot of organizations are seeing that percentage growing over the last 12 months. The majority actually somewhere between 2 to 5 points. So that's pretty material change in that cost base over a relatively short period of time. Again, you're sort of we'll dig into what's causing that. But that we can see is going to be having a direct downward impact on margin, right? So the majority of people are seeing this result in impact on margin. So that's not, your cloud spend increasing is not just some sort of sat in your testing and development costs. That is hitting straight into the gross profit of your business, and materially changing, as we've been talking about, kind of the business model that you're operating. I think the key then is what's driving that. Yeah, and what are the main drivers that are showing that big rise in cloud spend as companies are growing, and actually, unfortunately, creating a kind of super linear cost growth of your cloud spend, even as you're scaling your business. And the cause, not surprisingly, we probably didn't bury the lead on this one, Ben, but we're seeing this is AI. So that spend increasing on AI, and we'll talk about what we mean when we say AI in a second, but we're seeing this as a major contributor to that change. The idea that now, and we're mostly surveying kind of, I would say, traditional SaaS CFOs, they're already seeing AI at 22% of their cloud spend. And that's up from, frankly, zero only 12, 18 months ago. So that's a dramatic change and a major contributor to that rise in cloud spend.
Yeah, and there's another poll here. What percentage of your cloud infrastructure spend is driven by AI? So love to hear that, guys. If you'd check out the polls, and Ed, I've done a lot of research on public tech companies and their earnings calls, and really focused on what they talk about around AI. And Wall Street analysts want to know, all right, all these legacy SaaS, now we're pushing AI into our product. We've got compute inference cost, and they want to know margin structure. What's this doing to revenue? Or can you charge more? And how is this impacting your cost structure? Two fundamental finance questions that Wall Street analysts want to know of these big public tech companies, of just how AI, as they shift into the AI inference world, how is that going to affect your P&L?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder how many of us, I think, can easily differentiate this. And I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges, is you've got a big bill that comes through from your cloud provider, or indeed multiple different vendors that you're working with to provide your infrastructure. So you might be getting your cloud from one provider and you're accessing AI models from another provider. Can you accurately kind of segment this out and say, actually, what is your spend on AI? It's not as easy as it sounds to be able to figure that out and understand how that spend is actually operating, and what's driving that growth in AI spend. Is it people testing out new models and experimenting, or is it actually as a result of you've launched an AI product and it's really part of your production costs? What we wanted to do today is spend a bit of time to actually dig into what we mean when we say AI spend, because I think obviously there's a lot of people talking about it. There's a lot of noise around rapidly growing AI investments and the importance of embedding AI capabilities into your product, or transforming your software business to be AI first. But from a finance perspective, that's often quite hard to understand. What does that really mean? When we say AI spend, what really is behind that? And so I think it's probably easy to, first of all, think about it in three distinct areas. So the first, and obviously this was the story of 2024 and 2025, was training models. Everyone started using ChatGPT probably a few years ago now, and over the course of the last few years, there's been a lot of announcements of different model providers training their own models, and individual organizations spending money, renting or even buying GPUs and training their own models. Whether they're doing that from scratch, or they're doing what's called fine tuning, which is kind of taking a model and as the name suggests, kind of fine tuning its performance. So there's a lot of investment here. This is often when people talk about using GPUs, that's what they're talking about. They're often talking about saying, I'm going to go train a model, fine tune a model, and that's going to be the foundation of my new AI capabilities. So that's kind of training, and we'll talk about where that sits and how you account for those costs in a second. The second category is inference. And if you've only recently heard that word in the last 6 months, you'll all be forgiven, because this was not, I think this will be the Oxford Dictionary book, word of the year, I think, for 2026. But this is the new area that everyone's really focused on. If you've got training is, as the word suggests, training a model, then inference is actually then using that model in production as part of your products, as part of your service, to support your product. Obviously, you can train your own model and then run that, and that's what your inference spend is. But a lot of people choose to not run their own model, but actually use a pre-existing model off the shelf from one of the existing model providers. So that's Google Gemini, OpenAI, Anthropic. I think Anthropic is fast becoming the kind of IBM of models. No one gets fired for using Anthropic. And so a lot of the time we see software companies embedding Anthropic, using Anthropic, and we'll talk about kind of different ways you can do that in a second. But and that's using that model in your product. That's inference costs, and that's ultimately driven by people using your product and services.
Yeah, and Ed, a good example of just thinking about this training, right? We're using, say, OpenAI or Anthropic or Gemini, whatever. But a founder I interviewed for my podcast, it's a legal tech site, and it's at git.law, but it's like contract law, so you can upload your contracts, all that stuff. But yeah, you can't just bounce that against native OpenAI, so they write, I assume, a bunch of training, and all that data feeding in, and all, to actually have it. So it is actually an expert in contract law versus just going to an open prompt in ChatGPT.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this very nicely kind of brings us on to the third category here, which is it's easy to assume that, your cloud infrastructure costs are kind of going to be the same. And now we're layering on training. If we're training a model, we're layering on inference. Actually, what you see is when you're embedding AI into your product and service, it also can dramatically change your underlying infrastructure costs. At the end of the day, as you say, we all can kind of log into an AI chat product and start a raw prompt. But if you're going to be embedding this within your product, you want to be able to provide it with context, with data about the customer, about your organization. And so a lot of companies are now investing a lot more into kind of traditional cloud infrastructure to gather more data in the first place, to store more data, to process that data, to make it ready for the model, pass that to the model, take the results back, manipulate those results, present them back to the customer. So I think in times past, it was relatively easy to build a software business that was actually fairly data light, right? Ultimately, you weren't storing and processing a lot of data. If you had let's say a workflow application or a kind of simple kind of system of record application, actually it was surprising how little data actually needed to be stored and processed and managed to provide value. Whereas now, the amount of, the better, it's almost the case of kind of the more data that you have, the more you can feed the model, train the model, and that drives a lot of value and make sure that the results coming out of that model are more relevant to the end user. That's directly then resulting in much, much more infrastructure spend. So it's not just your Anthropic build that suddenly arrived and looking pretty scary, but it's also the knock-on increase in your compute and your data storage from Google or from AWS as well. So let's dig in then one step further into how you then think about how these costs are incurred or billed, how they should be accounted for, and so on. Because I think a lot of us starting to understand these different kind of categories of AI costs, but not maybe is easy to then figure out where actually you should place these in the P&L, how you should think about how these scale over time. So if we skip ahead and let's think first of all around training. So as we said, training, This is model development, experimentation. This is about, as I said, training your own model. So where does this happen? Well, typically this is happening in kind of one or two places. So either it's happening in your existing cloud provider. So if you use Google Cloud or you use AWS, then you're going to go and rent a bunch of GPUs by the hour, just like you've been renting servers by the hour, but then you're using those to train your model. There are also, however, a whole bunch of new neo cloud or kind of GPU accelerated compute specialist clouds. So these are similar in some respects to your AWS and your Google Cloud, but they specifically provide GPUs that you can buy. So companies like CoreWeave or Nebius are kind of specialists in this area. They often have kind of pricing advantage or just availability of GPUs. And I think, again, if you've heard the news in the last 12 months, then you would have heard a lot of kind of supply chain issues around when actually there are going to be GPUs available, or the next generation, the latest and greatest NVIDIA GPU chip coming out, and who has that. And obviously, the better the chip, often that leads to better models and improved results. And so a lot of this is kind of around that GPU conversation, whether you access those, and obviously Google and Amazon and Microsoft have access to a lot of GPUs. Google now have their own alternatives to NVIDIA, as do AWS. So they kind of have, NVIDIA is not the only player now providing access, providing GPUs and building GPUs, but that's typically where that is happening. And that's where you're going to be incurring an expensive bill, to say the least. We've been working with a couple of early stage businesses who are spending, they're training their own models and spending north of 50% of their revenue on model training. And obviously, the hope is that that's going to provide real value to their customers. But that's a resource intensive, capital intensive business. And of course, if you're going to train your own model, then it's really on you to keep that up to date. And that's one of the big considerations is, do you have the capital? Do you have the resources to not just train this model, but to train the next version, the next one? And you're starting to, if you're in that game, then you're almost in the same game as the likes of Anthropic and OpenAI, unless you have a very, very specific kind of focus set. And so that's the real challenge there. Where this often sits and should really sit in your P&L is really important. So model training is an expensive process, but that really should not be part of your cost of goods sold. And being able to separate out and really distinctly understand your GPU costs in relation to training models, and being able to allocate that correctly is really meaningful. If you stick that entire cost into your gross margin, that can have a very, very dramatic impact on your business model.
Yeah, and then I'd say, definitely R&D, but we do have to look, if we're capitalizing R&D under GAAP or IFRS, looking at, should that be capitalized along with product development too?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important to think of this as a capital investment. You are building a new service here and developing a new service, and it requires quite a lot of iterative development, testing, and experimentation as well. And these costs get bigger with, fundamentally, how big is the model? How much data are you training this model on? How often are you training it and retraining the model? Are you releasing a new model and updating a new model every 6 months, every 12 months? That becomes a really meaningful part. And obviously, the bigger the model in theory, the greater the output. We are starting to see diminishing returns and lots of innovation about how you can extend the performance of a model and the quality of the model beyond kind of just the model size. But it is a major, major investment for organizations if they're going to be training their own models. So really important to make sure that doesn't inadvertently damage your gross margin, your P&L. So that's kind of the first category and how that works. And if we obviously think then on to inference. So if we think about this is saying, okay, I'm going to access a model and I'm going to embed that into my software product, whether that's a model that I'm running, like the one we're just talking about, or if that's an off-the-shelf model, a developed and trained by a model provider. That could be OpenAI, Anthropic, or a very long list now of model providers. And a lot of companies that we see are actually opting not to train their own model, but actually to use an off-the-shelf model or combination of models, and then feed that with the right context, the right data, in order to get obviously the tailored responses for a specific customer. In terms of where that operates, so the easiest and the first route that most people took was, okay, I'll go to Anthropic, I'll go to OpenAI, and I'll access that model essentially via an API, right? So it's a kind of hosted with the cloud, with the model provider, and you access that through your code, and then you receive the bill at the end of the month. And that's kind of the original model. The alternative, which is getting increasingly popular, is using what's called an inference platform. So that's where essentially a cloud provider, infrastructure provider, is hosting a model or a selection of models that you can access and use. Large providers, people like Together AI or Fireworks, these are kind of independent, and they have a sort of whole library of all the different models that you might think of. From some of them provide these kind of proprietary models like OpenAI's models, but also there are a whole bunch of much cheaper open source models that are hosted by these organizations. They do the heavy lifting to make sure the model is available to you and scales and performs well, and they kind of act as the hosting wrapper. But also the cloud providers, AWS, Google, Microsoft, are absolutely in this game as well. So AWS has a new service called Bedrock. If anyone's heard Bedrock in their offices, that's what we're talking about. Google Vertex, and they also have kind of AI Studio, and Microsoft have AI Foundry as well. These are inference platforms. These are hosted environments where the models are made available to you, and they have abstracted away kind of the lower lying effort of kind of actually maintaining that model, making sure it works and operates. So it's simple, if you like, maybe to access OpenAI and query that. You might then actually say no because of latency, because of data transfer, because of data security. I actually want to access those models within my existing cloud provider. So if you're using AWS, it can make a lot of sense to access those models hosted within AWS Bedrock, and similarly with Google. The important thing is actually those models and that inference can be for many different things, right? So obviously we've been speaking about how those models are used. You're embedding those, you're querying those models as part of your customer facing product, and that usage is obviously being driven by your customers using your product, and that's going to be production cost. That should be part of your cost of goods sold. But obviously you may also be using those models internally. You may be testing, developing new services that you're going to add to your product. Those are not yet being used by your customers, but they're being used by your development team, your engineering team, to build out new capabilities. Those are not part of your COGS. They need to be able to, separate it out. And also a very commonly recurring thing, but you'll get a bill. Say you're using an Anthropic model and embedding that in your product, but your engineering team are also using Cloud code to develop and code and develop that product. So actually, your bill from Anthropic could come through, and it's going to be, a certain amount of that bill is related to production costs. Customers using your product. Some of that bill is, inference costs associated with testing and development, and some of that is accrual code costs. And really important to be able to separate those out and tease out between those actually what's being driven by your customers using your solution versus internal testing, development, and access. And obviously then it's easier to start to think about how those costs are being driven. The more customers you have, the more actively they're using your product, the more kind of AI enriched your product is, are all going to drive costs. And we'll talk a little bit about this in a second, but the choice of models and the pricing models of the pricing of those models can also have a huge impact on how much you're going to be spending. And finally, we've spoke about this before, but when you're spending money on training and inference, it's not in isolation. It's almost certainly going to be driving additional underlying infrastructure costs from your core cloud provider on compute, storage, data transfer, data storage. So these are, again, just like we're talking about with inference and training, understanding which of those costs are related to testing and development versus your actual production, product, and how much data you're storing, how much data you're transferring and passing over to the model, how much you're getting back from the model and having to process. I was working with an AI native startup yesterday who's thinking very, very carefully about actually how much data they're sending over to a model, what had a size of what's called the context window, essentially how much information gets passed to the model and how much they are actually asking the model to send back. They didn't contain that, and the models were being kind of very talkative and sending them a lot of information, and that was really impacting the amount of data they had to process.
And then that's a great point, because I've built some of my own applications with Replit, an AI coding tool, a software metrics app, an app to run my services business. And that's it. What I learned from talking to the coding agent is like, how much data, because the whole AI security thing is like, well, where does my financial data live? Well, all right, it's taking the finance data, it's passing what it needs to pass over to AI to analyze it. That, say Gemini is not going to keep the data there, it's going to send it back. At least, my CFO understanding. But you're right, that context window. And I've seen that where it's like, I was only passing 800 characters, or as I was passing this. So yeah, that's really important. Am I passing gigabytes of data or megabytes of data for AI to analyze and bring it back into my application?
Yeah. And it's that kind of classic thing. The longer you have a customer, maybe the more data that you've gathered on that customer, say you're tracking interactions or financial data or other data that you're capturing, if you continue to say, okay, I'm going to give the full context of this customer to the model every time I call that model, then your costs are just going to grow very, very rapidly for every customer. And of course, that means that customers early in their life cycle look fantastic from a margin perspective. There's just not much data yet on that customer. We don't have much to process. But as that customer matures, you're going to have worsening margins all the time. And then zoom back out one level, that's fine if you're acquiring lots and lots of new customers, right? Because you've got lots of them at that really cheap early stage in the journey. And so your margin looks great. But the moment your growth starts to slow, you'll start to immediately see your gross margin deteriorate. And everyone's going to sit there and go, how is growth connected to margin? Why just because our growth's gone from 100% to 50% has our margin also deteriorated at the same time? And it's exactly these kind of challenges of really understanding how these models are fed and the information that they give back, and working quite closely with engineering, as we'll talk about in a second, to really understand how they're actually using these models is incredibly important, and doing so at a super early stage. And we've been kind of touching on this already, but let's talk about this, right? Which is, what are those levers to determine what's actually driving those costs, right? We've spoken about here, but usage intensity, how much have you embedded AI into your products and services? How many calls are going from your product back to an AI model backwards and forwards? And obviously, I think a lot of us are really keen to see, how much, really push how much value we can deliver to our end customers. And so it's really tempting to make as much use and kind of embed AI models as deeply and as kind of pervasively into your product as possible. But it's actually really important to think quite carefully about how you do that, right? And are you kind of over providing value to lower cost customers, or thinking about actually what is the real value to these customers, and how deeply should you be embedding to different cohorts of customers, and thinking very carefully about, rather than saying, okay, everything has to be modeled, everything has to be AI enhanced, what actual parts of the product and service really are getting real meaningful value by introducing AI. The second part is, sorry,
I was going to say, this is a great slide to screenshot, guys, if you're not looking at the screen right now, because so important. It is a bit of a black box for CFOs, just like cloud hosting. Now AI costs that we understand. So I think this is, a great slide to screenshot or pass to your team.
Yeah. So talk to your engineering team and say, okay, where are we embedding AI? Is that part of our paid product? Is that part of our free product? Is that somewhere where we're seeing a lot of interaction from the customer or low interaction? How close is that to value from our perspective? The second part is then model selection. And this is something that is so important. Anthropic have just an example, have a whole sort of different families of models, which have radically different costs, right? So you have the kind of top of the line Opus model, all the way through to HiQ and much cheaper version of the models. Those have radically different costs associated with them. So most models are charged on what's called a token basis. The classic question I get is, what's a token? And the answer is, that's impossible. I can't answer that question. But in truth, it's I think the answer is roughly a word, but sometimes a little bit less. But they're charged on cost per million tokens, and that cost per token can be radically different, dependent on which model you're using. And smart engineering teams are making really proactive choices about which model to use. And that doesn't always have to be the same model for your entire product. You might say, okay, I need an overarching, really smart model that kind of does the planning and orchestration of what we're doing. But for specific execution of specific tasks, maybe I can use a much cheaper model to manage that. And people are really thinking already very carefully about, not throwing the Ferrari of models at every individual task, when actually a cheaper model can actually deliver a very similar outcome. And thinking quite carefully, you're sat there with a certain amount of kind of costs that you're incurring to per customer or per feature to deliver your service. One of the big ways you can think about how your gross margin and your unit economics may improve over time is actually having a plan for enhancing your model selection. So you might be at 20% gross margin or 20% cost base for running for a particular user now. But if you can think through, we think we can move 40% of our model interactions to cheaper models, because we can tailor which ones we use for specific tasks. That can have a really meaningful impact, even if you have the same level of usage. The third area is token volume. We kind of touched on this before with context windows. The more data you send to the model, the higher costs. The more tokens you're going to use, the higher costs you're going to generate. So those long prompts, the really verbose outputs can have a meaningful impact. And so being really careful about, even if you're storing a lot of data, how much of that you actually are passing to the models to understand, to get the output. And when you ask the model to provide an output, is it giving you a 4-page essay response, or is it being very, very succinct? And if you are, and make sure your engineering team's asking for those kind of tight responses, is actually directly going to impact it. And the last one is around architectural design. There are a whole bunch of things that your engineering team are going to be doing in the way that they've designed the workflow around those models, to make sure that they're thinking about cost as part of the actual architectural design process. So, how often are they retrying? If one call fails, are they retrying that? As we talked about, are they switching models? Are they very low-hanging fruit for many people is actually caching models, which means basically if this request has already been sent before, let's not actually call the same model to ask the same question again. Actually having cached and batch responses, often those are a lot cheaper. These are low-level engineering decisions, but because we're talking about such high cost intensity activity, having an understanding of are we doing caching? Are we doing batch processing? Are we being smart about the amount of data we're sending to the models? Are we thinking about which models we should actually use? These are all the kind of cost conscious decisions that and conversations that need to be happening when actually you're at this really early stage in the development. This is not something that needs to be left for, when you've got 10,000 users happily using your platform. And so the simple kind of maths of this, if we work up from this, from bottom up to how we get to here, it's, how many tokens are we, sending across? How many how much data are we sending across, and what's the cost for that particular model? How many interactions are occurring that's triggering calls to, so tokens and cost per token gives you kind of the cost per interaction. Right? Every time you interact with the model, how much cost are you incurring? Then how many interactions are actually occurring for each user? Are we being really intensive with this, or is it just being implemented in a few most high impact areas? That gives you kind of cost per user. And then when you roll that up and you think about revenue, and unfortunately for everyone who wants to talk about pricing, because obviously pricing comes up in all these conversations, we'll have to park that for the next 4-hour-long webinar, I think, on pricing as it relates to AI. But obviously that's a huge topic for everyone. But ultimately, when you're thinking about what's the cost per user against the revenue that you were generating, that really gets you to that gross margin impact.
Yeah, and
so it does get driven from bottom up. From the cost per token is a really meaningful part to all of this, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was going to say, for the CFOs in the audience, and I've learned this just from building my own AI apps that use AI, is looking at because it's hard to estimate tokens. Like, you just need usage to understand the input and output tokens, and how much on average does one query use in tokens, and what's that cost. So CFOs, I think, really have to get hooked up with the CTOs and get into some of that data to understand now unit, token usage on kind of how the system is being used. And that's really important. For example, I built this app that classifies domain names to software categories because I've covered 10,000 funding events. And like you said, it will cache, if that domain has been categorized already, it'll cache it so it doesn't go and use AI again. But then I know, all right, the token usage per domain check, and then the estimated Gemini cost per that check.
Yeah.
So then I can see, all right, if I was going to launch this as a SaaS app, how much would I charge for every domain that someone uploads and categorizes to a software category?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the kind of translation exercise we're talking about, right? Because we're kind of traditionally thinking about what's the total bill I get from AWS or Google at the end of the month, that horrendous 70-page PDF that we all get that's indecipherable, and the kind of high level analysis. But actually, over on the other side, it's sort of how many tokens are we actually making per request? What's the cost for them? How many requests are we making? What's the cost per interaction? How often are we calling this, caching this, and so on? It's about kind of bridging these and having those conversations and translating. And I think it's really valuable for finance leaders to start to get to grips with what is a token, what is what models are we using, how are we using those models, and being able to have that proactive conversation. And I think it's really important that this is actually happening. We're seeing this increasingly happening super early in the journey, right? So I think with traditional cloud spend, it was sort of like, okay, we made a choice way back in the midst of time to use AWS, and the credit card got stuck on the bill, and the team went off and built the platform. And it's only kind of once those costs started to get to sort of, in the tens or the hundreds of thousands a month, that people started to say, okay, maybe I need to get a handle on this. What we're seeing when it comes to AI is actually, it's really valuable and really important for finance to lean in much, much earlier to try and understand, even when you're kind of beta testing, you've got a kind of closed group of customers that are trying this new product, new AI enhanced service, really at that point to start to talk about what are the economics of this. So, we've got customers that, are spending hundreds of thousands a month on overall cloud, but actually they're much, much more focused on the $5,000 they spent on Anthropic in the last months in this small closed beta of the product that they're going to launch, and understanding, as I said, the kind of unit economics. How many customers do we have? How many requested interactions do they have? What was the unit cost of delivering that? because that's really, obviously, I think everyone's really hopeful that that's going to scale very quickly because the product is going to be valued and adopted, and you're going to win a lot of customers as a result. But it's getting in way earlier to understand those cost per user, cost per feature. And as you said, Ben, it's a conversation between finance and engineering, and aligning that and having shared vocabulary and a kind of shared understanding of, on the finance side, understanding what tokens and caching and batch requests mean. And on the engineering side, understanding what margin and unit economics and, these terminology means. And it's about creating that kind of shared alignment, shared vocabulary that's going to be very, very important. And, the typical things that people are talking about is like putting some guardrails around this at this early stage. And I mentioned it before, but a great thing is to say, okay, we're going to pilot this. We're going to set up a, initial beta group that's get access to these new AI capabilities, these new part of our product that has these. We're going to put a kind of wrapper on this. We're not going to let all of our customers use this. We're going to kind of try and contain these costs. And then we're going to really focus on understanding unit economics at this pilot stage. And again, this came from our kind of survey around how would finance teams really think about how to put guardrails around those initial investments to understand it. And I think it's not surprising to see that kind of structured pilot phase is really the one there where people want to contain those costs, understand those costs, and spend the time to dig into the unit economics before this scales. And we see that, as I said, across all of our customer base who are investing here now. It's getting in early, aligning finance and engineering at that pilot stage, thinking about token usage, thinking about architecture early, that really then benefits when these costs kind of scale pretty quickly. And for all of those who feel like this is doom and gloom and a lot more to learn, it is going to have real impact from real benefits. The last kind of area that we surveyed was actually what's the results of this. When you have finance and engineering working well together, do we actually see positive outcomes here? I think so. What we asked was, kind of key questions about how predictable is your spend, how confident are you on your kind of COGS, how much visibility do you really have around your spend, and how mature are you around thinking around these kind of cost optimization strategies. And what was really, really clear is if it's just engineering focused on this, it's pretty hard, right? There's not much predictability or visibility and confidence around these spends. If it's just finance who are owning this, it's better. I think we've got most of a finance audience today. So obviously, if finance is going to own it, it's going to be better. But the key is it is a joint conversation. It is really about aligning finance and engineering around what are we spending, why are we spending it, how can we accurately understand how to allocate these costs, how to model the unit economics of these costs, and how do we think proactively about optimizing these costs, even in the case of AI, even at a very, very early stage. It's positive, I think, to hear that getting these teams aligned and getting that shared vocabulary is gonna pay out. Keep your questions coming. I know there's a few people in the chat. Yes, we will be sharing a recording. Yes, we'll be sharing the materials as well. So if you're late or you weren't able to screenshot a particular slide, don't worry. We'll be able to share these and you can watch again at your heart's content. And just a kind of final plug and mention, a lot of what we've been talking about today has been based on the cost of compute market research that we did with over 100 CFOs. So you've seen some of the headlines of that today, but if you want to go and dig into the detail, you can see that cloudcapital.co/the cost of compute. We'll share the link again. Thanks, Eric. And also, if you're sat there going, my goodness, my cloud bill is already bigger than it needs to be, I need to get this back on track. I'd love to dig into token costs and batch processing, but actually I just need to shave that bill back down to size. Well, don't worry. We've just launched very recently a straight cashback program for your cloud spend. So You can go to cloudcapital.co/cashback, and you can get immediately 5% back on your entire cloud bill. And it doesn't require your engineering team to spend months explaining to you why you're spending what you're spending, or make loads of changes, which is really important. So just get that money back, get yourself back under the budget line, and buy yourself some time to dig into understanding cloud costs. Do what Ben's been doing, get on Replit and start building your own apps and learning firsthand. I think is a great idea.
Yeah, I've definitely learned a lot there. With in cost differences, input tokens, output tokens, how much data is using. So it's an eye opener. So, and I love the cashback kind of credit.
There you go. Take control, get your cash back. Thank you, everyone. I know we've been having questions throughout this, and thank you, Ben, for joining us today and digging into this with us. It's a fascinating topic. I think it's something where finance and engineering teams are going to have to collaborate, and there's real value in doing so. I'm sure we'll be back to talk about more results. We're going to be continuing to work with CFOs across the industry to understand how this environment changes, and as we all know, it's changing very, very rapidly. So thank you for the time, Ben. Really appreciate it. Enjoy a sunny, warm Scottsdale. Yeah. Sorry to all of those stuck in the snow on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us. Thanks
it was great to be here. A lot of requests for slides, and I know, Ed, you plan to continue that benchmarking on cloud costs, which I think every
Absolutely.
CFO wants to know, because it's obviously going to be changing over time. So everyone stay tuned with that. And my email is ben@thesaascfo.com if there are any questions for me. But yeah, enjoy this. A lot of great educational slides for your team in there. So yeah, Ed, thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, guys. Take care.